Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than most people around her. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a lean build, she often heard comments about her size during her early days in the Navy. But what people couldn't see was the fire that burned inside her chest, the determination that had carried her through the most grueling training program in the military. The crowded bar in Norfolk was buzzing with conversation and laughter. It was Friday night, and sailors from the nearby base had gathered to unwind after a long week. Sarah sat quietly in the corner booth, nursing a soda and watching the room. She preferred to observe rather than be the center of attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that didn't reveal anything about her military background. At the bar, Lieutenant Kevin Morrison was holding court with a group of junior officers. He was everything Sarah disliked about certain military officers: loud, arrogant, and convinced that his rank made him superior to everyone around him. Morrison stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the kind of confidence that came from never being truly challenged. The lieutenant had been drinking for hours, and his voice grew louder with each beer. He was telling stories about his desk job at the base, making it sound like he was some kind of war hero. The younger officers laughed at his jokes, partly out of respect for his rank and partly because they didn't want to deal with his anger. Sarah tried to ignore the noise, but Morrison's voice carried across the entire bar. He was now talking about women in the military, making crude comments that made her stomach turn. She had heard this kind of talk before, but it never got easier to listen to. The other patrons seemed uncomfortable too, but nobody wanted to confront a military officer. The conversation took a darker turn when Morrison started talking about female sailors on the base. He made disgusting comments about their appearance and questioned their ability to do their jobs. Sarah's hands clenched into fists under the table. She had worked twice as hard as most men to earn her place in the Navy, and she knew countless other women who had done the same. When Morrison began describing what he would like to do to some of the female personnel, Sarah had heard enough. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. The sound caught the attention of a few people nearby, but Morrison was too busy with his stories to notice. Sarah walked toward the bar, her footsteps silent despite the crowded room. She had learned to move quietly during her training, a skill that had saved her life more than once during missions. As she got closer, she could see the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of the junior officers. They wanted the lieutenant to stop talking, but they didn't have the courage to speak up. Morrison was in the middle of another crude comment when Sarah finally reached the group. She cleared her throat softly, but the lieutenant was too drunk and too focused on his audience to pay attention. The younger officers noticed her, though, and their expressions grew even more uncomfortable. Finally, Sarah spoke up in a calm, clear voice that cut through the noise of the bar. She asked Morrison if he could keep his voice down and maybe choose more appropriate topics for his conversation. Her tone was polite but firm, the kind of voice that suggested she was used to being listened to. Morrison turned around slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus on Sarah. When he saw her, a cruel smile spread across his face. He looked her up and down with obvious disrespect, taking in her small frame and quiet demeanor. To him, she looked like an easy target, someone he could intimidate without any consequences. The lieutenant's response was immediate and aggressive. He told Sarah to mind her own business and suggested that she should go back to wherever she came from. His words were slurred, but the hostility in his voice was crystal clear. The entire bar had gone quiet now, everyone watching to see what would happen next. Sarah remained calm, her hands relaxed at her sides. She had faced much worse situations than this, and she knew that losing her temper would only make things worse. She tried once more to reason with Morrison, explaining that his comments were making other people uncomfortable and asking him to show some basic respect. This only made the lieutenant angrier. He stepped closer to Sarah, using his height to try to intimidate her. His breath smelled like beer and cigarettes, and his eyes were bloodshot from drinking. He began yelling at her, calling her names and questioning what right she had to tell him what to do. The junior officers looked like they wanted to disappear. They knew their superior was out of line, but they also knew that crossing him could hurt their careers. The other bar patrons watched nervously, unsure whether they should intervene or stay out of what looked like a military matter. Sarah stood her ground, never backing down despite Morrison's aggressive posture. She had learned long ago that showing fear only encouraged bullies to push harder. Her training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly even when facing danger. This situation was nowhere near the most dangerous she had encountered, but she knew it could escalate quickly if she wasn't careful. Morrison's anger reached a boiling point when Sarah refused to be intimidated. In his drunken rage, he saw her quiet confidence as disrespect to his authority. He had spent years believing that his rank gave him the right to treat people however he wanted, especially women who dared to challenge him. The tension in the bar reached a breaking point as Lieutenant Morrison's face turned red with anger. His hands were shaking, whether from alcohol or rage, nobody could tell. Sarah could see the warning signs clearly. She had been trained to read body language and recognize when a situation was about to turn violent. Morrison raised his voice even louder, attracting the attention of everyone in the establishment. He began pointing his finger at Sarah, jabbing it toward her face as he spoke. His words became more personal and more vicious, attacking everything from her appearance to her intelligence. The other customers looked away uncomfortably, while the bartender reached for the phone, probably considering whether to call security. Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and controlled. She had learned this technique during her most difficult training exercises, when instructors would scream at recruits for hours trying to break their composure. The key was to stay centered, to never let emotions cloud judgment or reaction time. The lieutenant's tirade continued for several minutes, but Sarah never responded with anger. Instead, she spoke in the same calm voice, suggesting that perhaps he had too much to drink and should consider going home. Her reasonable tone only seemed to infuriate Morrison more, as if her refusal to be rattled was somehow an insult to his authority. Several of the junior officers tried to step in, quietly suggesting that their superior might want to call it a night, but Morrison waved them away aggressively, telling them to stay out of it. He was completely focused on Sarah now, seeing her as a challenge that needed to be crushed. In his alcohol-clouded mind, backing down from a woman would be the ultimate humiliation. The situation escalated when Morrison began making threats. He told Sarah exactly what he thought should happen to women who didn't know their place. His language became increasingly violent and disturbing, causing several people near the bar to move away. The bartender was now openly reaching for his phone, but something made him hesitate. Sarah's expression never changed, but inside, she was calculating distances and angles. She noticed Morrison's stance, the way he favored his right side, how his balance was affected by the alcohol. These observations were automatic now, ingrained through years of training that had taught her to assess every situation for potential threats and opportunities. When Morrison realized that his verbal assault wasn't having the desired effect, he decided to escalate further. He moved even closer to Sarah, invading her personal space in an obvious attempt to intimidate her. His breath was hot against her face as he continued his threats. But she never flinched or stepped backward. The junior officers were becoming increasingly nervous, realizing that their superior was completely out of control. They knew that this situation could end badly for everyone involved, but they still didn't have the courage to physically intervene. Their military training had taught them to respect the chain of command, even when their superior was clearly in the wrong. Morrison's frustration reached its peak when he realized that nothing he said was going to break Sarah's composure. In his drunken logic, he decided that words weren't enough. He needed to establish physical dominance to prove his point. The alcohol had completely destroyed his judgment, making him forget that he was in a public place with dozens of witnesses. Without warning, Morrison drew back his right hand and swung it toward Sarah's face. His intention was clear. He wanted to strike her hard enough to humiliate her and show everyone in the bar who was in control. The punch was thrown with all the force his anger and alcohol could muster. But Sarah had seen the attack coming long before Morrison even began to move. Her training had taught her to read micro-expressions and body language, skills that allowed her to anticipate actions before they happened. As Morrison's hand moved toward her, time seemed to slow down in her mind. The lieutenant's punch was wild and uncontrolled, the kind of swing that relied on size and strength rather than technique. Against an ordinary person, it might have been devastating, but Sarah was far from ordinary, though Morrison had no way of knowing that. He was about to learn that his assumptions about her had been completely wrong. Sarah moved with fluid precision, her body responding automatically to years of training. She shifted her weight slightly to the left, allowing Morrison's fist to pass harmlessly by her face. The movement was so subtle that some witnesses later claimed she never moved at all, that Morrison had simply missed his target. The lieutenant's momentum carried him forward, his balance completely compromised by the missed punch and the alcohol in his system. He stumbled slightly, confusion replacing anger as he tried to understand what had just happened. He had been certain that his punch would connect, and the fact that it hadn't left him momentarily disoriented. Sarah could have ended the confrontation right there. Her training had given her dozens of ways to neutralize Morrison without causing permanent damage, but she chose to give him one more chance to walk away, still hoping that the situation could be resolved without violence. Instead of retaliating, Sarah stepped back and spoke in the same calm voice she had used throughout the encounter. She told Morrison that he had crossed a line and suggested that he should leave the bar before things got worse. Her offer was generous considering that he had just attempted to assault her in front of dozens of witnesses. But Morrison's ego couldn't accept what had happened. The fact that a woman had made him look foolish in front of his subordinates was more than his pride could handle. The alcohol had destroyed his judgment completely, and he was now operating purely on instinct and wounded pride. The lieutenant steadied himself and prepared to try again, this time putting his full weight behind the attack. He had no idea that he was about to face someone whose training went far beyond anything he could imagine. Morrison's second attempt was even more aggressive than his first. The missed punch had only fueled his rage, and now he was determined to prove his dominance through brute force. He planted his feet more firmly and wound up for what he intended to be a devastating blow to Sarah's jaw. His face was twisted with anger and humiliation as he prepared to strike. The entire bar held its breath as the lieutenant drew back his arm. This time there was no doubt about his intentions. He wanted to hurt Sarah badly. Several patrons started to move forward, finally ready to intervene, but they were too far away to stop what was about to happen. Sarah remained perfectly calm, her mind processing the situation with the clarity that came from years of high-stress training. She could see exactly how Morrison was going to attack, and she already knew how she would respond. But first she gave him one final warning, speaking just loud enough for everyone to hear. She told Morrison that he was making a serious mistake and that he should reconsider his actions. Her voice carried a note of authority that hadn't been there before, a subtle change that suggested she was no longer just asking him to stop. The warning was clear, though most people in the bar didn't understand its significance. Morrison either didn't hear the warning or chose to ignore it. He was beyond reason now. Driven by alcohol and wounded pride, with a roar of anger he launched his second attack, throwing a powerful right cross aimed directly at Sarah's jaw. This punch had all of his weight behind it, and it would have seriously injured most people. But Sarah wasn't most people. As Morrison's fist approached her face, she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting her defensive skills. This time her movement was more pronounced, a clear demonstration of trained technique rather than lucky reflexes. Sarah ducked under Morrison's punch while simultaneously stepping to her right. The movement was perfectly timed, allowing his fist to pass over her head while positioning her for a counterattack. As she moved, she grabbed Morrison's extended arm with both hands, using his own momentum against him. The lieutenant found himself in a position he had never experienced before. His punch had missed completely, and somehow Sarah had ended up behind him with control of his arm. Before he could react, she applied pressure to specific points that her training had taught her, points that could cause excruciating pain without permanent damage. Morrison cried out in surprise and pain as Sarah applied a joint lock that he had never encountered in his basic military training. The technique was precise and controlled, demonstrating a level of skill that shocked everyone watching. The lieutenant tried to break free, but every movement only increased his discomfort. For the first time since the confrontation began, Morrison realized that he might be in serious trouble. The woman he had dismissed as an easy target was demonstrating fighting skills that were far beyond anything he had expected. The alcohol was still clouding his judgment, but even he couldn't ignore the reality of his situation. Sarah held the lock for just a few seconds before releasing Morrison and stepping back. She could have done much worse. Her training included techniques that could have ended the fight permanently, but she chose restraint. Even after being attacked twice, she was still trying to give the lieutenant a chance to walk away with his dignity intact. Morrison stumbled forward, rubbing his arm where Sarah had applied the joint lock. The pain was already fading, but the memory of helplessness remained. He had never been controlled so easily by anyone, let alone a woman half his size. The humiliation was worse than any physical pain she could have inflicted. The bar was completely silent now, everyone staring in amazement at what they had just witnessed. The junior officers looked shocked, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had never seen their superior handled so easily, and they were beginning to realize that there was much more to Sarah than met the eye. The bartender had stopped reaching for his phone, recognizing that the situation had shifted dramatically. It was clear that Sarah was not the victim he had initially thought she was. Instead, she appeared to be someone with serious fighting skills who was showing remarkable restraint in dealing with an aggressive drunk. Morrison turned around to face Sarah again, his face red with embarrassment and renewed anger. The joint lock had sobered him slightly, but it had also wounded his pride even more deeply. He couldn't accept that a woman had made him look foolish in front of his subordinates and the entire bar. Sarah could see that Morrison wasn't going to give up. Despite being outmatched, his ego wouldn't let him walk away. She had encountered this type of person before during her military service, individuals who would rather get seriously hurt than admit they were wrong. It was a dangerous mindset that often led to unnecessary violence. She tried one more time to defuse the situation, speaking in a voice that was no longer just calm, but carried clear authority. Sarah told Morrison that he had already embarrassed himself enough, and that continuing would only make things worse for him. Her tone suggested that she knew exactly what she was capable of, and was trying to spare him from experiencing it. But Morrison was beyond reasoning. The combination of alcohol, humiliation, and wounded pride had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. He had passed the point where he could back down gracefully, and his military training had taught him that retreat was often worse than defeat. The lieutenant began to circle Sarah like a predator, looking for an opening to attack. He had realized that his straightforward approach wasn't going to work, so he was trying to be more tactical. But his movements were still affected by alcohol, and his strategy was obvious to someone with Sarah's training. Sarah remained in the center of the space that had opened up around them, turning slowly to keep Morrison in sight. Her posture was relaxed but ready, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. The other patrons had backed away, creating an impromptu fighting ring in the middle of the bar. Morrison feinted to his left before launching himself at Sarah in what he hoped would be a surprise tackle. He intended to use his size advantage to take her to the ground, where he believed his strength would give him the upper hand. It was a reasonable strategy against most opponents, but Sarah wasn't most opponents. As Morrison charged toward her, Sarah realized that the time for restraint had passed. He had forced her hand, and now she would have to show him exactly what a Navy SEAL could really do. Morrison's charging tackle would have been effective against most people, but Sarah had been trained to handle opponents much larger and more skilled than the intoxicated lieutenant. As he rushed toward her with his arms outstretched, she waited until the last possible moment before making her move. Instead of trying to avoid the tackle completely, Sarah used Morrison's momentum to her advantage. She stepped slightly to the side while grabbing his leading arm, then used a hip throw that sent him flying across the bar. The technique was executed with such precision that Morrison found himself airborne before he even realized what was happening. The lieutenant crashed into a nearby table, sending chairs flying and drinks spilling everywhere. The impact was hard enough to knock the wind out of him, but Sarah had controlled the throw carefully to avoid serious injury. Even while defending herself, she was still showing remarkable restraint. Morrison lay on the floor for several seconds, trying to catch his breath and understand how he had ended up there. The throw had been so quick and unexpected that his alcohol-fogged brain couldn't process what had happened. All he knew was that one moment he had been charging at Sarah, and the next he was lying in a pile of broken furniture. The bar erupted in shocked murmurs as the patrons realized they had just witnessed a display of serious martial arts skill. Many of them had served in the military themselves, but they had never seen techniques like the ones Sarah was demonstrating. It was becoming clear that she had training far beyond what any ordinary sailor would possess. Sarah remained in a ready position, watching Morrison carefully to see if he would continue the fight. She hoped that the throw had finally convinced him to give up, but her experience told her that some people needed to be completely defeated before they would admit they were wrong. The lieutenant's pride had already cost him dearly, but it might demand an even higher price. Morrison struggled to his feet, his movements unsteady from both the alcohol and the impact. His shirt was torn and there was a small cut on his forehead where he had hit the table, but instead of recognizing that he was outmatched, the throw had only made him angrier. His wounded ego demanded revenge regardless of the consequences. The junior officers finally found their voices, calling out to their superior to stop the fight. They could see that Morrison was completely outclassed and they were worried about what might happen if he continued. But the lieutenant waved them off angrily, too proud to accept help or advice from his subordinates. Sarah could see the determination in Morrison's eyes and knew that he wasn't going to quit. She had hoped to end the confrontation without seriously hurting him, but he was forcing her to escalate her response. Her training had taught her to match the level of force to the threat, and Morrison was rapidly becoming a more serious threat to himself and others. The lieutenant picked up a broken chair leg from the debris around him, brandishing it like a club. This crossed a new line in the confrontation. He was now armed and clearly intended to cause serious harm. The other patrons backed away even further, some of them heading for the exits as they realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Sarah's expression became more serious as she assessed this new threat. An armed opponent, even a drunk and clumsy one, required a different level of response. She could no longer afford to focus purely on restraint. Morrison's safety was now secondary to the safety of everyone else in the bar. Morrison swung the makeshift club in a wide arc, trying to catch Sarah off guard. But his movements were telegraphed and clumsy, made worse by the alcohol and his recent impact with the table. Sarah easily ducked under the swing, then moved inside his guard to neutralize the weapon. With lightning-fast precision, Sarah struck Morrison's wrist with a knife-hand technique that caused him to immediately drop the chair leg. The strike hit a pressure point that temporarily numbed his entire hand, making it impossible for him to maintain his grip. The weapon clattered to the floor, removing the immediate threat. Before Morrison could react to losing his weapon, Sarah followed up with a series of quick strikes to specific points on his body. Each technique was designed to cause temporary paralysis or discomfort, without permanent damage. Her movements were so fast that most observers couldn't follow them, seeing only a blur of motion. Morrison found himself unable to move properly as Sarah's strikes took effect. His legs felt weak, his arms wouldn't respond correctly, and his balance was completely compromised. He tried to fight back, but his body simply wouldn't obey his commands. The techniques Sarah was using were far beyond anything taught in basic military combat training. The lieutenant staggered backward, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. For the first time since the confrontation began, he was beginning to understand that he had made a serious mistake. The woman he had attacked wasn't just skilled, she was operating on a completely different level than anything he had ever encountered. Sarah could have ended the fight right there with any number of finishing techniques, but she chose instead to give Morrison one final opportunity to surrender. She told him calmly that the fight was over and that he should stay down for his own safety. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced much more dangerous opponents than a drunk lieutenant, but Morrison's pride still wouldn't let him quit. Even though his body was barely responding to his commands, he tried to launch another attack. It was a pathetic effort, more of a stumbling lunge than a real assault, but it forced Sarah to take more decisive action. This time, Sarah didn't hold back as much. She intercepted Morrison's clumsy attack with a perfectly executed counterstrike that sent him sprawling to the floor again. This time he didn't get up immediately. He lay there gasping, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The bar was completely silent except for Morrison's labored breathing. Every person present had just witnessed a masterclass in combat skills, delivered by someone who looked like she should have been completely overmatched. The junior officers stared in amazement, while the other patrons whispered among themselves about what they had just seen. Sarah stood over Morrison, not in a threatening way, but ready to respond if he tried to continue the fight. She could see that he was finally beginning to understand his situation, but she also knew that wounded pride could make people do desperate things. She remained alert, prepared for any possibility. Morrison tried to speak, but the combination of alcohol, exhaustion, and the effects of Sarah's pressure point strikes made it difficult for him to form words. He was beginning to realize that he had attacked someone far more dangerous than he could have imagined, and the implications of that realization were starting to sink in. As Morrison lay on the floor struggling to catch his breath, the reality of his situation began to penetrate through the fog of alcohol and adrenaline. The woman standing over him had just demonstrated fighting skills that went far beyond anything he had encountered in his military career. The techniques she had used were precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. Sarah remained motionless, watching Morrison carefully for any sign that he might try to continue the fight. Her stance was relaxed but ready, like a professional athlete waiting for the next play. The transformation from the quiet woman, who had been sitting alone in the corner, to this confident warrior was remarkable to witness. The junior officers finally overcame their shock and moved toward their superior, but Sarah raised a hand to stop them. Her gesture was subtle but carried unmistakable authority. She told them calmly that Morrison wasn't seriously injured, just temporarily incapacitated by pressure point techniques that would wear off soon. One of the younger officers asked Sarah who she was, his voice filled with awe and respect. The question hung in the air as everyone in the bar waited for her answer. It was clear that she was military, but her skills suggested training far beyond what most service members received. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. She had spent years keeping her background secret, blending in with regular Navy personnel to avoid the attention that came with her true specialty. But Morrison had forced her hand, and now there was no point in maintaining the pretense. Speaking clearly so everyone could hear, Sarah identified herself as Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEALs. The announcement sent a wave of shock through the bar. Several of the military personnel present immediately came to attention, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone from one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. The junior officers looked at Morrison with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Their superior had just attacked a Navy SEAL, one of the most highly trained warriors in the American military. The implications of his actions were staggering, both for his career and potentially for his freedom. Morrison's eyes widened as the full weight of Sarah's identity sank in. Through his alcohol-clouded mind, he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't just attacked a random woman in a bar. He had assaulted a member of an elite special operations unit. The legal and professional consequences would be severe. Sarah knelt down next to Morrison, her voice taking on a more serious tone. She told him that she could have seriously injured or even killed him at any point during their confrontation, but had chosen restraint because she hoped he would come to his senses. Her words were a stark reminder of how close he had come to disaster. The lieutenant tried to sit up, his movements still unsteady from the effects of Sarah's pressure point strikes. He attempted to speak, perhaps to apologize or make excuses, but Sarah cut him off with a sharp gesture. She had heard enough of his words for one evening. Instead, Sarah began to explain exactly what Morrison had done wrong, both tactically and ethically. She pointed out how his attacks had been telegraphed and poorly executed, how his reliance on size and strength had made him predictable, and how alcohol had destroyed any advantage he might have had. But more importantly, Sarah addressed the behavior that had started the entire confrontation. She spoke about respect, professionalism, and the responsibility that came with wearing a military uniform. Her words carried the weight of someone who had earned the right to speak about these topics through years of exemplary service. The junior officers listened intently, recognizing that they were receiving a lesson in leadership from someone whose credentials were beyond question. Sarah's conduct throughout the evening, her initial restraint, her attempts to defuse the situation, and her controlled response to violence demonstrated the kind of professionalism they should aspire to. Morrison struggled to his feet with help from his subordinates, his face flushed with embarrassment and shame. The alcohol was beginning to wear off, replaced by the sobering realization of what he had done. He had not only embarrassed himself publicly, but had also committed what could be considered assault on a fellow service member. Sarah stood and faced Morrison directly, her expression serious but not angry. She told him that she would not file charges or report the incident through official channels, but only on the condition that he seek help for his drinking problem and attend anger management counseling. Her offer was generous considering what she could legally do to him. The lieutenant nodded weakly, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. He mumbled something that might have been an apology, but his words were barely audible. The fight had been knocked out of him completely, replaced by shame and the beginning of understanding about his behavior. Sarah turned to address the junior officers, her tone becoming more instructional. She reminded them that leadership meant setting an example, treating all personnel with respect and maintaining professional standards at all times. Her words were a clear contrast to the behavior they had witnessed from their superior. The bartender, who had been watching the entire confrontation in amazement, approached Sarah cautiously. He thanked her for handling the situation without destroying his establishment and offered to call the military police if she wanted to press charges. Sarah declined politely, saying that she believed Morrison had learned his lesson. As the tension in the bar began to dissipate, other patrons started to approach Sarah. Several veterans wanted to shake her hand, expressing their respect for her service and her handling of the situation. She accepted their thanks graciously, but remained humble about her actions. Morrison's subordinates helped him toward the door, eager to remove their superior from the scene of his humiliation. As they passed Sarah, one of them stopped to apologize for their lieutenant's behavior. She accepted the apology but reminded them that they had their own responsibility to speak up when they witnessed inappropriate conduct. The junior officers promised to ensure that Morrison got the help he needed and to report his behavior through appropriate channels. They had learned valuable lessons about leadership, courage, and doing the right thing, even when it was difficult or potentially harmful to their careers. As Morrison was escorted from the bar, he took one last look back at Sarah. In that moment, he seemed to finally understand what he had encountered. The woman who had defeated him so thoroughly represented everything he should have been as a military officer: skilled, disciplined, professional, and worthy of respect. After Morrison and his group left the bar, the atmosphere slowly began to return to normal, though the evening's events would be talked about for years to come. Sarah returned to her corner booth, hoping to finish her drink in peace, but she quickly realized that anonymity was no longer possible. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the military community in Norfolk. Within days, the story of the lieutenant who had attacked a Navy SEAL was being discussed in mess halls, barracks, and officer clubs throughout the base. The details grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core message remained the same. Respect was earned, not demanded. Morrison's career took a dramatic turn following that night. True to their word, his subordinate officers reported his behavior through proper channels. Combined with his drinking problem and the public nature of his humiliation, the incident triggered a formal investigation into his conduct and fitness for command. The lieutenant found himself facing a military tribunal within 2 weeks. The charges included conduct unbecoming an officer, public intoxication, and assault. Several witnesses from the bar testified about his behavior, painting a picture of an officer who had completely lost control of himself and his responsibilities. Sarah was called to testify at the tribunal. Though she maintained her stance of not wanting to pursue charges personally, her testimony was professional and factual, focusing on the events of the evening without editorial comment. She described Morrison's behavior, his multiple attacks and her responses, all while maintaining the respect due to military proceedings. The tribunal was particularly interested in Sarah's restraint throughout the confrontation. Military experts testified that someone with her training could have ended the fight immediately with potentially lethal force, but had instead chosen to use minimal force while protecting herself and others. Morrison's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been provoked and was defending himself against an unprovoked attack. However, the testimony of multiple witnesses, including Morrison's own subordinates, painted a clear picture of who had been the aggressor throughout the evening. The lieutenant's drinking problem, which had been overlooked by his superiors for years, finally received the attention it deserved. Military counselors testified about the pattern of behavior that had led to the confrontation, showing that the incident was not an isolated event, but part of a larger problem with alcohol and anger management. The tribunal's verdict was swift and decisive. Morrison was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from the service. His military career, which had spanned over a decade, was effectively over because of one night's poor decisions. Sarah's role in the incident brought her both unwanted attention and professional recognition. Her superiors commended her restraint and professionalism, noting that she had handled a difficult situation in a way that reflected well on the SEAL community and the Navy as a whole. The story became a case study in military leadership courses, used to illustrate the importance of maintaining professional standards and the consequences of abusing authority. Sarah's conduct was held up as an example of how military personnel should handle confrontational situations, both in and out of uniform. Morrison's former subordinates underwent additional leadership training and were reassigned to different units. The incident had taught them valuable lessons about speaking up against inappropriate behavior and the importance of maintaining professional standards. Regardless of rank or position, the junior officers who had witnessed the confrontation later credited the experience with changing their approach to leadership. They learned that true authority came from competence and character, not from rank or intimidation. Several of them went on to distinguished careers, carrying the lessons of that night with them. Sarah eventually received orders for a new assignment, leaving Norfolk and the attention that had followed the incident. She preferred to serve quietly, without the notoriety that came from public confrontations, even when she had handled them perfectly. Years later, Morrison completed his alcohol treatment and anger management programs. He found work in the private sector, where his military experience was still valued despite the circumstances of his departure. The incident had been a harsh but necessary wake-up call that ultimately saved his life and the lives of others who might have suffered from his unchecked behavior. In his new civilian career, Morrison became an advocate for military personnel struggling with alcohol abuse. He spoke at treatment centers and support groups, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about how quickly a military career could be destroyed by poor decisions and untreated addiction. The former lieutenant often reflected on that night in Norfolk, particularly about Sarah's restraint and professionalism. He came to understand that she had shown him more mercy than he deserved, choosing to defeat him without destroying him completely. Her actions had taught him more about leadership in 5 minutes than he had learned in years of military service. Sarah continued her distinguished career with the Navy SEALs, participating in numerous classified operations around the world. She rarely spoke about the incident in Norfolk, preferring to let her continued service speak for itself. Her teammates respected her not just for her skills, but for her judgment and character under pressure. The bar in Norfolk where the confrontation took place became something of a landmark in military circles. New personnel arriving at the base would often be told the story, usually by someone who claimed to have been there that night. The tale served as both entertainment and education, reminding service members about the importance of professional conduct. The incident had ripple effects throughout the military community that lasted for years. Training programs incorporated lessons about bystander intervention, encouraging personnel to speak up when they witnessed inappropriate behavior. The story demonstrated that remaining silent in the face of misconduct was itself a form of complicity. Military psychologists studied the incident as an example of how stress, alcohol, and toxic masculinity could combine to create dangerous situations. Sarah's response became a model for de-escalation techniques, showing how superior training and emotional control could resolve conflicts without unnecessary violence. The junior officers who had witnessed Morrison's downfall went on to become leaders themselves, carrying the lessons of that night into their own commands. They implemented zero-tolerance policies for harassment and created environments where inappropriate behavior was challenged immediately, regardless of rank. Sarah's story inspired countless women in the military who faced similar challenges with inappropriate behavior from male colleagues. Her example showed that it was possible to stand up to bullies and abusers while maintaining professionalism and dignity. She became a role model for female service members struggling with their own difficult situations. The incident also highlighted the importance of specialized training in the military. Sarah's SEAL training had given her not just physical skills, but the mental discipline to use those skills appropriately. Her restraint under extreme provocation demonstrated the value of psychological training alongside physical preparation. In the years following the confrontation, both the Navy and other military branches reviewed their policies regarding off-duty conduct and alcohol abuse. The Morrison incident became a case study in how personal problems could escalate into public embarrassments that damaged the reputation of the entire military. The story lived on in military folklore, told and retold in various forms across all branches of service. Each telling reinforced the core message that rank and authority meant nothing without character, and that true strength came from knowing when not to use force rather than simply possessing the ability to do so. Sarah Martinez had entered that Norfolk bar as an anonymous sailor looking for a quiet evening. She left as a legend, having demonstrated what it truly meant to be a warrior in the finest sense of the word. Her actions that night embodied the highest ideals of military service: courage, honor, discipline, and the protection of others, even those who didn't deserve it.